Week 5, Lesson 2. So you guys just listened to the Week 5 Lesson 1 video on movement and how that is important to healing your body and removing inflammation. You learned about how to create connection with your kids and your family to feel grounded, how to incorporate this movement throughout your day in the simplest of ways. But now we're going to totally go back to diet because we're still going to be swapping out these inflammatory foods, right? So far we've talked about processed sugar, we've talked about GMOs and alcohol, and now we're going to touch on Frankenwheat or wheat. I call it Frankenwheat because wheat has changed so much since our grandparents' days. Back in the day, a whole wheat bread was really good for us, right? And that came from it's now called ancient sprouted wheat. It's the kind of wheat that actually, if you look in my book, you'll see this picture. Ancient wheat is very prickly. The actual plant is like, here's the picture. Let's see how well you guys can see this. So this is the ancient sprouted wheat right here. Notice how small the seeds are. They're not big and plump like this one, right? They're really small, thin seeds, kind of prickly and narrow. This over here is modern day wheat, and you can see how these seeds are really big and plump. That plumpness comes from gluten. So gluten is not all bad in small amounts, unless of course you have celiac disease or you have real allergy to gluten. The problem though is that wheat in general just are the wheat that is bought off the market and almost every place nowadays, unless it's specifically ancient sprouted wheat, has been super pumped. That's why I call it Frankenwheat. It's been super pumped full of gluten. It's been highly genetically modified. The DNA has been altered, and it is no longer a food, but rather a food-like product. On top of that, when it goes into our bread or cereal, whatever it may be that we're consuming, it's highly processed. It's been heated up very high, chopped up, ground up, stormed up, reheated, reprocessed. And you guys, our body does not like it. So we want to look at what kind of food swaps can we have that do not use wheat. And then I'll talk about the one exception when I do sometimes use wheat. So if you're baking, almost all, we had a kitty dog intervention over here. They'd almost just got in a fight. Okay, so if you're baking, or even if you're buying foods at the grocery store, foods that traditionally have wheat, you want to look at almond flour, cassava flour even, coconut flour. Those are the flours that I use most frequently and honestly are the best flours to use free of inflammatory ingredients. There's a lot of gluten-free products out there that are use potato flour and tapioca flour and a lot of other flours that while they're gluten-free, they're not that good for us. In addition, those gluten-free products are full of processed sugar, refined oils, preservatives, things to make those bars or cereals or whatever it may be taste really good. So you cannot rely upon gluten-free foods in this journey. Again, as always, you have to be a renegade researcher. Hold on. Tough. Sorry, my dog was growling at the cat. They're having a little issue here. Tough, come here. So you have to really be that renegade researcher and make sure that if you are buying a gluten-free product, it's free of these other top inflammatory foods. Okay? So we want to swap wheat out this week with gluten-free options, ideally almond flour, hazelnut flour, coconut flour. There's a lot. You can sometimes even use protein powder. Like if you look at my protein pancakes that you'll see in my book, I use protein powder as the flour. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of coconut flour to that recipe as well, but you can even like have fun using protein powder as a flour, and depending on the recipe would really vary which type of flour you use. And I believe in the Facebook group you can search this or ask me, but they have a little image that talks about like when you're swapping almond flour or coconut flour out, what you need to do to alter the recipe to make it work well. So coconut flour you typically use a very small amount of because it expands and absorbs a lot of moisture, so you need to add extra oil and eggs to coconut flour. So there's some tricks to the trade for sure. But fun to play with. And when you use the recipes in Piece of Cake or the recipes on the Facebook group, you don't have to think about the conversions. They're already embedded for you. When you're at the grocery store, just be sure to read the ingredients. There's every day there's also new grocery store swaps coming out, such as Siete. You guys should check this brand out. Siete makes a grain-free tortilla chip made with, I believe it's avocado oil or extra virgin coconut oil. I'm pretty sure it's avocado oil and sea salt. So it's a great option for a tortilla chip. And then there's also a Siete makes tortillas. Some out of cassava flour, some are chia and almond flour, some are just regular almond flour. They have like 3 or 4 different variations to help people who have different food allergies. And so that's a really fun brand for tortillas, for example. The other thing I did want to mention is when I choose to use ancient sprouted wheat, there is a bread called Ezekiel bread. Ezekiel bread is the bread that we buy in as our family most often. In my book, I have a fluffy sandwich bread recipe, which is delicious, and we make that all the time here too. It's you blend up like 6 ingredients in a blender, pour it into a bread dish, and you have a beautiful homemade loaf of fluffy sandwich bread. But if you need to buy something at the grocery store, Ezekiel bread is the way to go. Udis and all these other gluten-free options all have processed sugar. They all have refined oils, but Ezekiel Food for Life bread does not. They have a gluten-free option that uses agave, I believe, as a sweetener, which is okay. It's not raw agave, it's just regular agave. And then the traditional Ezekiel bread, there's a flax, there's a whole bunch of different flavors. But the reason I like that is because it's an ancient grain. So we're eating the kind of grains and wheat that our body originally was intended to eat before it was plumped full of the gluten and before it was genetically modified and DNA modified, right? So that's a bread that I will sometimes make French toast with. And if you're like, ooh, that sounds good, again, the recipe's in my book that you all have access to in week 1 of your student center. Okay, you guys, this week we are doing 2 challenges. We're moving our body for 20 minutes a day, and we are taking out all wheat unless you use a little bit of ancient sprouted wheat. Be sure to be a renegade researcher, read the ingredients, look for the inflammatory foods that we've covered, and let's take our health to the next step. I'm super excited. We'll see you next week.